Okay, Axel Anderson. I'll mute my phone here, and you're up.
Okay, sounds good. Is the audio coming through now? Can everybody hear me? I guess everybody's muted, so I'll go on with the assumption that you can hear me.
Yeah, you're good, Axel.
Okay, thanks. So thanks for inviting me to give this short presentation. I guess we can move through to the next slide. We can move through this quite quickly. Given the limited amount of time, really wanted to focus in on the legislation and policy pieces, as those are most pertinent for those of you taking the exam. I've broken this up into the legislation and policies related to the province, and then there's a few pieces of legislation that have snuck into the exam in the previous exam questions as it relates to federal legislation. And not all of this is in particular related to watersheds or hydrology. Some of it is related to fisheries and other things that live in the water. Historically, I've covered that over the years, and that's sort of been contained within the watershed management component. So we can move through this if you want to move to the next slide. As it relates to forestry, the Forest Management Planning Standard, which you'll hear a little bit more about, I'm assuming, has two components that relates to the protection of watershed and riparian values. One is section 5.7 is the spatial harvest sequence. And then 5.9, under the criterion, there's a sort of guidance to look at water yield. Over the years, this has changed a little bit, although the standard hasn't been updated. You may, if you're reviewing particular plans, the water yield itself has been replaced with sort of an equivalent clear-cut area approach in a lot of the more recent plans, based on direction from the government forest hydrologists while the plans are being developed. Again, I've added a link to the bottom of this slide, so if you're interested in taking a look at the standard, which is probably not a bad idea for a lot of the exam questions, you can review these sections as it relates to the watershed components. The ground rules, again, another very important component of forestry in Alberta, and in particular as it relates to watersheds, is the water course classification, and then the standards for what you can do around the water courses. And those are in table 1 and 2 respectively. Again, the link is at the bottom to the standard general template that the province uses. Those are negotiated from time to time with individual companies, so there may be changes to these table 1 and table 2, but my understanding is, at least on the exams, the table 1 and table 2 that are in the provincial template, I think from 1994, are the ones that are almost always on the exam. So if you flip to the next slide, I think I included just a snapshot of what table 2 looks like. So table 1 essentially defines all those classes on the left-hand column, and then table 2 gives guidelines and recommendations as to what you can and cannot do next to and over some of these features. The other part of legislation that is important is related to the Water Act, and I've included here the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act because it does speak to delivery of deleterious substances into the water bodies. But for purposes of the exam and probably most of your careers, the Water Act and the Code of Practice for watercourse crossings is important to pay attention to. In particular, the requirement or lack thereof of the requirement under the Code of Practice. So we can flip to the next slide, okay. Where the Code of Practice sets out a requirement as to what can and cannot be done over different classes of streams, and there's a general exemption in the green area, which I believe is the next slide, that outlines where you do not need to follow the Code of Practice. So this is important to pay attention to. I think in previous exam questions, this has been there. It's a bit of a tricky one because I think most people assume that there's a blanket green area exemption, but if you actually read the regulation, there is specific criteria where it applies and where it does not apply. So I guess worth taking a note of, looking at the regulations and the code of practice and understanding what applies and what doesn't apply. Yeah, that's good for this one. I think we move to the next. So another sort of piece of legislation that has guidance as it relates to potential watershed management, generally at a higher level. Everything that we're talking about up to this point relates to ground rules, forestry in particular. The land use framework under the LCs Act has legislative authority to develop regional plans and then sub-regional plans associated with that. So depending on where you are in the province and where you're operating, there may be higher level plans as it relates to the regional plans and as legislated, so piece of legislation under the LCs Act. A piece of policy to note, the Water for Life. So Water for Life, sort of an overarching policy framework that Environment and Parks has historically used for a variety of different things. But one of the things that are relevant to operations, forestry operations, and other things on public land would be the watershed planning advisory councils, and in particular, you look on the left, their mandate to develop integrated watershed management plans. And so these are really large-scale general direction developed by these watershed planning and advisory councils that can give guidance on how Alberta meets their goals of the Water for Life policy related to these different watersheds. And there's a WPAC for each of the main watersheds that you can see on the right. It's just a figure from the website showing the different types of WPACs, and depending on where they are in their evolutions, some of the ones in the south and say the North Saskatchewan are quite evolved. Some of the other ones are still sort of going through this process. Next slide, please. Another piece of policy to note would be the Alberta wetland policy, more for just understanding that it's out there and potential impacts to operations on public land. Essentially, it works on the premise of having a defined process to classify wetlands based on their relative value. And if you go to the website, or read some of the documents, there's a very well-defined way of doing this, from A being high value down to D being low value, and then lays out a process to either avoid, minimize, or replace any impact to those wetlands that have been identified. Next slide, please. So moving on to the federal legislation, and I've added the links here. It's probably best that you take a look at the links. There's the Federal Fisheries Act, and I noted up at the first slide, there's a few other acts as well, navigable waters, and a few things that conceivably could impact operations and have impacted operations and planning in forested areas in Alberta in the past. But these are sort of the main ones that you may run into on a day-to-day basis. So the Federal Fisheries Act, we'll talk about that in a bit, and then SARA, the Species at Risk Act. And we can move to the next slide. So the Federal Fisheries Act and SARA, as it relates to the watershed, the water components, or the things that live in the water, the fish, are both handled by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada. Their website lays out quite nicely how you can approach and deal with activities in and around water as it may impact these acts. So if you go to their website, I have provided the new link there. There's a self-assessment to sort of determine how to do that. And then in the recent updates to the website, you can see in the bottom right, they've actually pulled in the SARA listed aquatic species, put it front and center. So there's a process to go through there as well. If we go to the next slide, and why SARA, the Species at Risk Act, is is quite relevant is that there are relatively new species listed that relate to the water. So the West Slope cutthroat being the main one. And if you look at this map, they have a new interactive map app within their website that you can go through to identify if you're doing operations in these areas or planning to do operations in these areas, where there may be implications for a species at risk and all the associated requirements that go along with that, that really come a long way with that. So again, the Federal Fisheries Act and the Species at Risk Act in particular, the West Slope cutthroat, are of importance to Alberta, and they're both housed within the Department of Fisheries and Oceans Canada now, and they do have a very good process to go through to identify if you're going to have an impact that they're concerned about, and if you are, what you need to do as far as steps following that. So I think that's it, David. Oh no, sorry, one more. So just to drive home the fact that we do have a listed species, and in the past I've differentiated between this and the Cowswick, which is the list of species of concern that the special committee on this puts this together. There's a few other species that are found in Alberta, the Athabasca rainbow trout, Arctic grayling, that are on the Cowswick list that may be updated into the SARA list in the future. So something to keep note of, that West Slope cutthroat are currently listed, and there may be some others in the future. So I think that's it, Dave.
Thank you very much, Axel. We'll open up, just if you have questions for Axel around the forest hydrology, watershed, or species at risk that he talked about. We'll have a few minutes here for questions. Please unmute your line, ask your question, and then mute your line back again. So hearing no questions for Axel, we'll move to our next presenter, which is Tim Bolt, doing integrated resource management. I'll pass the mic and everything over to you, Tim. You could drive your own presentation.
That's good. Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everybody. We've got a lot of ground to cover with regards to integrated resource management system, or as it's typically referred to as IRMS. So I'm going to jump right into it. I'm going to cover 5 main topic areas, the first being the nature of the system itself, followed by the legislation that drives it, and the products that come out of that, namely the land use framework, the regional plans, and the EMS, otherwise known as the environmental management frameworks. So to start off with, IRMS as a whole, it is a philosophy by which Alberta really will achieve responsible resource stewardship and manage the 3 main pillars within the province, namely social, economic, and environmental values. On purpose, it's quite broadly defined. It doesn't get into the weeds too much, and it not only looks at the management, but also the land use of all the resource encompassed within the umbrella of the IRMS system. And it's also founded upon the principles of cumulative effects management. So what that means is values, resources, and use aren't looked at in isolation. They're looked at in a cumulative sense, and management actions are taken within that mindset. So if you look here, there's a lot of components that comprise the IRMS, and I'll start from the center out, and it involves numerous players. The government has undergone in recent years a deliberate reorganization to better deliver the IRMS, including the establishment of new agencies such as Alberta Environmental Monitoring, Evaluation and Reporting, and as well the Alberta Energy Regulator. And at the core and leading the system is the government of Alberta, and as well there's leading ministries such as Alberta Agriculture and Forestry, Municipal Affairs, Aboriginal Relations, Alberta Energy, and you get the idea. And it also includes clear roles and responsibilities for each player. So there's specific values that each core agency are responsible for, and those are unique to those particular agency. More importantly, it provides for the involvement of all Albertans. So whether you're a member of the public service, or you're a member of an involved stakeholder or organization, or whether you're just a member of the general public, you're involved under this system. So key messages to take away from this is the means by which Alberta intends to achieve responsible resource stewardship based on this notion of three pillars, the triple bottom line: economic, social, and environmental outcomes. That's a key message to take away today. And this is done through cooperation of multiple agencies, namely government departments, external groups, and the public. And again, it involves all of the resources within the particular geographic area in question, namely everything from energy, minerals, forestry, agriculture, land, air, water, biodiversity, and again, all of the economic, social, and environmental outcomes that come from those pieces. Okay, now I'm going to get into the legislative authority by which the system is managed, and this is known as ALSA, the Alberta Land Stewardship Act, and it's the legal basis for land use planning in Alberta. The legislation is intended to plan for the future needs of Albertans to manage growth while respecting existing property rights. The government of Alberta amended ALSA in May of 2011, so it's not exactly new. And this was to clarify the original intent of the legislation, including a statement which is, this is very critical, that the government must respect the property and other rights of individuals, including private landowner rights. It also provides direction and leadership towards identifying objectives of the province for the three particular pillars: economic, environmental, and social. It also provides a means to plan for the future. So not only what do we have on our land base now, what are our objectives for what we have now, how do we plan for the future and forecast? It also provides for coordination of decision-making concerning issues on the land base, particularly with regards to biodiversity, social issues, human settlement, natural resources, and the environment. It also creates legislation and policy that enables sustainable development by responding to cumulative effects, for example, the environmental management frameworks, the EMFs. So, takeaways is the Land Stewardship Act. That's the driving piece of legislation, and effectively, it is the one act to rule them all, including the Forest Act. It guides regional planning, which is our highest level planning in the province. And you'll note section 17.4, if there's a conflict or inconsistency between this act and any other enactment, this act prevails. And as well, if you link that with section 45.11 of the Forest Act, in the event of a conflict between either a timber disposition or a timber quota and the provisions of any applicable ALSA regional plan, the regional plan prevails. So basically, if there's a conflict between anything and what's in a regional plan, the regional plan prevails. Now, the framework, which was created in order to create our regional plans, there's 7 in the province. The purpose is to manage growth and not stop it. Do it in a coordinated manner for balancing Albertan social and environmental goals with the economy, and that's what it's all about. Doing growth, but doing it in a smart way. It provides a blueprint for land use on the land base, where all land uses are brought under one umbrella, considered cumulatively with regards to their objectives and strategies and outcomes and reporting. And again, I'll refer to the 3 pillars. You'll be hearing this over and over again. The economy, the economic pillar, ecosystems in the environment, or the environmental pillar, and people-friendly communities, or the social pillar. As well, cumulative effects management will be used at the regional level to manage the impacts of development on air, land, water, and biodiversity, and those three will be managed in my fifth topic today, which are the environmental management frameworks. So, how do you develop smart growth? It's done in a land use system that effectively balances our three pillars. It manages both public and private lands and natural resources to manage these pillars. It provides for growth and has that done with regards to the population growth and the economic activity that we're currently seeing in Alberta. And it allows for us to provide for the global demand for our resources. So Alberta is open for business, but we manage our business in a smart, cumulative manner. So what are the key items to take away from the land use strategies? The 7 strategies identified to improve land use management decision-making. Develop 7 regional land use plans. Alberta as a whole is divided up into 7 regions. A land use secretariat and a regional advisory council is created for each region, and cumulative effects management to manage the impact of development on air, land, water, and biodiversity, as well as the development of a strategy for conservation and stewardship on private and public lands. It promotes the efficient use of land in its decision-making, and it establishes both an information monitoring and knowledge system. And what is also critical is the inclusion of Aboriginal peoples in land use planning. So what do the regional plans for each of the 7 regions actually look like? You'll see that there's 7 there up on the map. LARP was the first plan approved. This was done in 2012. And a 5-year review was initiated in 2017. This is standard practice under ALSA. And following up to this, the very first version of the South Saskatchewan Regional Plan, otherwise known as SSRP, was approved in 2014. NSRP is currently under development. And following that, we're looking at the development of the Lower Peace, Upper Athabasca, and Red Deer regional plans. So, in developing these plans, there is a hierarchy that takes place. I've got the graphic up on board. Provincial policy and legislation drives the regional plan. Management frameworks for each regional plan inform a number of the values, air, water, and biodiversity, for example. And out of these regional plans, things like sub-regional plans are used to implement the objectives and strategies of the regional plans. An example of a sub-regional plan is a forest management plan. And following that, there's sectorial and operational plans, and then operational and regulatory decisions that are done way down in the weeds. Again, here we have just a graphic highlighting all of the values that are considered cumulatively under the regional plan: economic, environmental, and social. The components of a regional plan is the strategic plan. What's your vision? What's your outcome and strategic direction? This is mostly narrative for the most part. And then the implementation plan gets into how do you implement your vision and the outcomes that you identified in your strategic plan. And then the regulatory details plan encompasses all the regs that land users and decision makers must comply with. Things like the timber management regs, as an example. Regional plan development, I'm not going to get too much into the details here just because it's very involved, but you can see generally the process, the players involved, and how the development goes. And again, all of the stages. Pre-planning, Regional Advisory Council is struck. They advise the public service as to, via report, what they think should go into a regional plan. Then a regional plan is drafted, environmental management frameworks are created, and following approval, implementation of the plan and the environmental management frameworks, you go and start doing it, and then you review. There's always a significant monitoring, reporting, and review component that goes into the next iteration of the regional plans, which is typically a 10-year cycle. So, for these regional plans, forestry plays a significant component. They support the regional outcomes of these plans. They also support the social outcomes of these plans and supporting our local community and providing public safety with regards to insect and fire risk. They also support environmental outcomes of regional plans with respect to air, water, and biodiversity components that are housed within the environmental management frameworks. And they also integrate provincial policies at the regional level. So they bring everything together under one single umbrella. And finally, the environmental management frameworks themselves, they're the key approach to managing the long-term cumulative effects of human development on the environment at the regional level, which is essentially cumulative effects management. They identify indicators which are chosen to help us determine if we meet the objectives. They're basically key criteria. Those key criteria have triggers and limits with progressive action based on the conditions found within the environment. So each indicator has particular triggers. Sometimes those triggers are yellow, orange, red, sometimes are green. And there's different management actions that come out of each of those particular triggers based on the severity of them. And the intent is the enhancement of the current system of our air, water, and biodiversity management, and all stakeholders are involved in the development and implementation. So the key principles of these EMFs, they're done regionally, they build on existing legislation, they're flexible, adaptable, they're continually updated, they provide clear communication so you know exactly what's being done, and they're created and evolved through collaboration. Here's an example of our EMFs.
You want to go back to that slide? Just hang here for a second because this is a key.
Sure. So within each regional plan, remember that again, there's 7 within the province. We have 6 management frameworks identified. One is specific to air quality. The next is specific to surface water quality. The next is specific to biodiversity management. And then there's groundwater management framework, the surface quality management framework, or quantity, pardon me, not quality management framework, and the tailings management framework. The ones in blue down at the bottom, those are currently released for LARP only, and we're developing EMFs collaboratively for LARP at the moment, as well as other regions, particularly the SSRP, and also for NSRP as it undergoes its development, which is currently happening. This is just a slide illustrating all of the inputs that go into our EMFs. So it's very collaborative. And our management framework approach. Here's a description of how they're all interlinked, where in the regional plan you have your regional outcomes and objectives highlighted in the EMF. Then within each EMF, values are indicated by indicators. There's also triggers and limits identified. And there's thresholds as well. So if a threshold is crossed, what do? The EMFs provide guidance on that. And as well, there's always monitoring and reporting to assess ambient conditions relative to those thresholds. And of course, should a threshold be crossed and the EMF calls for it, there's a management response as well as reporting. So EMF management response, there's a lot here. Basically, it follows a fairly generic suite of steps. What does our science say? What does it mean? What are we going to do about it? And were we successful? And there's a number of steps that answers all of those questions: verification, preliminary assessment, investigation, mitigative management actions, evaluation, and communication. And that is essentially what makes up the bulk of the decision-making process in the EMFs. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. We'll be taking questions both on the chat line and on audio if you wish, and I'll get set up for the next presenter, which is Chris Breen on forest tenure. So hearing no questions online, we'll go to our next presenter, which is Chris Breen, to introduce the topic of forest tenure.
Hi there, this is Chris Breen. I'm a tenure system specialist for the provincial government, and like Dave says, I'll be chatting with you about forest tenure in Alberta today. Forest tenure is set up basically to make sure that all the Crown-held forest resource is able to be allocated to specific industrial and commercial users. And the question always comes up is, why would we want to do that? And I'm trying to, there we go. Why do we want to have tenure? So there are several reasons that the province would want to have tenure and have specific rights associated with different stands of timber in different areas of the province. So the first is to make sure that we get stumpage and royalties for every tree that's cut in the forest and every cubic meter that's hauled to a mill. The government takes in stumpage, so a certain rate based on the volume that's hauled in, based on the product that's going to be produced, and based on the species of the tree. Another advantage or a benefit of having tenures for the province is the creation of in-kind services. So once a tenure is allocated or awarded, roads and other developments soon follow. So permanent roads, DLOs and LOCs have been put through the province to provide access for recreational use and for also other industrial use. Other advantages include reforestation. With tenure, it's a requirement that companies reforest, and it also helps to improve the forest resource within the province. So those are a few of the in-kind services that the province enjoys via the tenure system. Another one that's obvious is employment and taxes. We make sure that Alberta communities are kept vibrant and viable by way of the forest industry, and the backbone of that is the forest tenure system. Lastly, facility development is another benefit that we see and another reason to develop tenure. If there was no tenure and no rights associated with various pieces of land and forest, companies would never put in the huge amounts of money required to develop facilities. So forest tenure is definitely a security piece for the industry. So there are three major forms of tenure within Alberta. The first being the Forest Management Agreement, the FMA. That's the most secure and most robust tenure that the province issues. Next, we have quotas, and along with quotas go licenses. I'll get more into those as the presentation moves on. The quota is, I guess, the second most robust and second most secure form of tenure within the province. They can be issued based on a coniferous or deciduous basis. And they can also exist within FMAs, and I'll explain a little more about that as we move forward as well. The last form of tenure that we issue is the permit. These are smaller tenure types. They can either be for a commercial nature, commercial timber permits, or coniferous community timber permits. Can both be used for commercial development. And they can also be issued to deciduous users as well. We also have the local timber permit, which is a very small, non-commercial form of tenure, and the TM66, which is the firewood or Christmas tree permit. So the Forest Management Agreement is an area-based agreement. It is not volume-based. So if you were to look at a forest management document, you would find out that basically it allocates all of the wood or various species of wood within a land base to an industrial user. These are negotiated between a company and the government. And again, that just goes to make sure that the company is aware of what they're getting and that they see benefit in that agreement that they enter into with the Crown. Forest Management Agreement is a 20-year agreement. Every 10 years, the company has the opportunity to renew. And based on whatever criteria comes out of the Alberta Cabinet, that FMA would be renewed or potentially not renewed. And that's definitely a political process. I don't think we've seen an FMA not be renewed. Companies are responsible for their own forest management planning and reforestation. So a benefit to the FMA is that the government allows the company to do their planning. So the company has definitely a stake in how that land base is developed. The annual allowable cut, or AAC, is set through an approved FMP, and a requirement of Forest Management Agreement is to have an FMP or a Forest Management Plan. So the Forest Management Agreement doesn't actually set or specify the amount to be cut, whereas the Forest Management Plan that is empowered and and granted via the agreement does stipulate that kind of item. The FMA also carries with it its own operating ground rules, or OGRs. Typically, each company has a different set or different nuances to their OGRs, but there are a lot of underlying items that are similar throughout, such as watershed items, such as how the spatial harvest sequence is set up and operationalized, several items like that. Once the FMA is actually approved, it becomes the harvest authority once the forest management plan is approved. So with a lot of these tenures, you'll need several documents in place in order to actually cut timber. For the FMA, once that FMP exists, the FMA itself is the harvest authority, but there still needs to be an annual operating plan, or AOP, put through a local forestry office in order to conduct operations. And here's a little bit of trivia to keep you all on your toes. The first FMA was signed June 8th in 1951 with Northwestern Pulp and Power in Hinton, now West Fraser Mills. So you can thank the first FMA for the wonderful smell you get driving through Hinton. Currently, there are 20 FMAs in Alberta, covering most of the productive forest land. And then within a lot of those FMAs and some areas that aren't occupied by FMAs, there are about 130 quotas, either deciduous or coniferous within the province. As I said before, quotas and permits can overlap FMAs. So for instance, the Manning Forest Products FMA has DMI deciduous timber allocations embedded within it. The ANC Forest Management Agreement area has several other coniferous timber quotas embedded within it for different industrial users. So on to timber quotas. As I mentioned before, they can be either coniferous or deciduous. They can also be either land or area-based. So the FMA was area-based, so it allocates all the timber within a specified area, or, which in most cases happens, they can be volume-based for the coniferous timber permit, or coniferous timber quota. So that volume allocation is typically a percentage of the allowable cut that exists within a forest management unit. For deciduous timber allocations, they're the same thing. They can be either area or volume-based. Typically, they're area-based in that they provide a fixed volume amount, so 50,000 cubic meters, for instance, regardless of what happens with the AAC within the forest management unit. These are typically issued through historic grants or competitive sales. So these competitive sales can also be auctions. They could be a sealed tender. And the historic grants can also happen by way of an award, where the government would determine that for any number of reasons, an entity or organization deserves to have a quota issued to them in a non-competitive process. These are a 20-year term tenure, and you can renew them every 20 years. As I said previously, the province used to do all the planning, but this has all been offset to the companies now. In many cases, though, where these are embedded in an FMA, the long-term sustainable forest management planning is done by the FMA holder, and the quota holders operationalize that plan within their particular quotas. So as I said, the FMA is typically the one that does the actual forest management planning whenever there's an FMA in place. So embedded quota holders and deciduous timber allocation holders would participate in a plan development team, and then they would also be responsible for the implementation of that plan. All of the operations of a timber quota operator must be in keeping with either provincial ground rules for those quotas that occur on provincial lands that are not occupied by an FMA, or they have to prescribe to the FMA's ground rules if they are an embedded quota holder or deciduous timber allocation. With the timber quotas, once you have a timber quota issued to you as a company, that is not an authority to harvest timber. So once you have your quota, you have the rights to trees, but you need a timber license in order to actually start your harvest operations. And the timber license is an area-based disposition that would cover a certain portion of or an entire forest management unit, and you would have stands allocated to you within that license. So again, the quota is only a right to volume; it is not a right to harvest. And then again, with timber quotas, you would be required to pay all Crown charges set by the timber management regulation, so timber dues, holding and protection charges, and a lot of other revenue-based items. So as I mentioned, the coniferous and deciduous timber licenses are dispositions really that are issued underneath of or through the authority of a timber quota. And they allow the quota holder to harvest their volume within that FMU or within the area prescribed by the DTA. So these are, it says area-based tenure, it should say area-based disposition. And they accompany the CTQ or DTA, and their length is between 5 and 10 years typically, and they're also renewable. For commercial timber permits and coniferous community timber permits, these are sold by the minister to various operators, often again by sealed tender or open competition such as an auction. Anyone, anywhere can bid on these, so long as they meet various criteria. They have to be in good standing with the province. They have to be residents of Alberta, and often there'll be a requirement to be within the geographic area of those timber permit programs. The community coniferous timber permits are issued directly in miscellaneous timber use. So that's something that's built into the forest management plan for that area, whether it's an FMA holder's management plan or a Crown-held unit with a Crown-developed management plan. And the whole intention behind these is to support local, smaller operators and communities. These are going to be volume-based as well, generally in a specified area. And often the planning for this will be done by the government or by the FMA holder within that area. It's a short-term tenure between 1 and 5 years typically. So I said in the past, the province did all the planning and layout. In some cases, some of the operators are doing a little bit of the layout and planning, but typically the forest areas are still taking care of these. Crown charges are defined for these operators within the timber management regulation. So again, all the dues, holding and protection charges. Regulation rate of dues or bid on competitively sold permits. So these are determined more or less by the competitive process. And again, if you're operating within an FMA, you would be subject to the OGRs or operating ground rules of that FMA. If it's on unoccupied Crown land or an FMU that doesn't have an FMA on top of it, you'd be subject to the provincial ground rules. All of these require an AOP to operate. So again, the permit is a right to volume, not a right to harvest. That AOP has to be in place and approved by the Crown. Local timber permits are a 1-year term. They expire at the end of each timber year. The timber year runs from May 1st to April 30th. They're very cheap comparatively to the other types of tenure and not competitive. It's a $20 charge plus some reforestation levies. And that'll depend, as it says here, based on where that permit is located. If it's a more remote area, there's likely going to be a higher levy associated with it. The maximum timber amount that you can harvest with these permits is 50 cubic meters of green volume or large amounts of salvage if there's been a fire, if there's been a forest health event where there's sanitation harvesting required. You could get a larger amount of salvage cut associated with these permits. These are not for commercial use, it's personal use only, so folks that like to heat their homes or cabins. It's not for generating revenue of any kind. The permit in this case is the harvest authority, so unlike the quotas and the CTQs, the permit itself enables the permit holder to go and start harvesting timber. And then dues and all that are managed as per the timber management regulation. And the last type of tenure is the forest products tag, the Christmas tree permit, or the TM66. So it is a 30-day term. It expires quickly. A $5 charge to get it issued. You can get them online. And they are for personal use only. You can transplant 20 trees that are less than, it should be 2.5 meters in height. You can also harvest 3 Christmas trees or 5 cubic meters of green wood. So here's an overview map showing all the different forest management units in the province and FMAs. You can see that the largest FMA in the province is AAFMP, takes up about 10% of the land base of the province. And within that, there are several embedded quotas. And you can see also all the way down to some of the smaller FMAs down in the southern part of the province, and some larger ones towards the north again. So they vary greatly in size. And as I say, within each one of these, there may be several embedded quotas or DTAs. FMA boundaries typically cover one or many forest management units. So as you can see, all these are units. And in some cases, say for ANC's FMA down here in W15, it occupies the entire FMU, whereas AAFMP occupies several FMUs towards the northeast of the province there. A quota can only cover one FMU, so an interesting distinction between the two. And lastly there, an FMA holder can hold a quota within their area. They could purchase a quota from a different user, or they could potentially have the rights to only deciduous in one FMU, while a quota holder has the rights to coniferous, and they could purchase that quota and have it amalgamated into their FMA. You can find this table online. It just stipulates all the you can find this online, or you might have it in the Commons or in your study material, just stipulating all the differences between different tenure systems, or the tenure types rather, in Alberta.
So as the exam chair, remember this table. Memorize it. That's all.
It's a really good table to memorize. And it's a lot of fun to do too. Any questions, feel free to ask them. And my contact as well is on there, so you can always shoot me an email if you have any questions on the tenure system.
We do have a question, Chris. So what happens to timber quota between the 20-year terms? Will a timber quota continue until the government makes a decision if the approval for a second 20-year term is lagging behind? So a 20-year term was issued, government hasn't made their Pupina group, it lagged, and now 2 or 3 years later, does that quota continue on as per existing operators?
So I haven't seen a quota come to expiration before, but typically we'd engage with the quota holder well before that quota is to be renewed and start the process there. There's no forest management planning associated with it, so a lot of the renewal criteria are centered around whether or not they're in good standing with the Crown, whether their dues are paid, whether their reforestation obligations are met. So it's not as arduous a process as an FMA. If an FMA is coming up for expiration, that's a different process where it can be extended, and it becomes a political question at that point too, as to what council sees the benefit there. An example of that has been the FMA for Toko in High Prairie has been inactive for years due to poor prices on OSB. So that has just kind of been kept in purgatory more or less, and it's being renewed right now as that company sees value in restarting their operations associated with that land base.
Okay, another question coming in. Can a quota holder have more than one quota and then in more than one FMU?
Yes. So there are a whole slew of companies that have multiple quotas in multiple FMUs. Miller Western, for instance, has quotas in S11, W15, previously W13, S20, P21, I think, as well. So yeah, you can, as long as the company has the wherewithal to set those up and they're in good standing, they can have permits or quotas issued for them all over the province.
Perfect. Thank you, Chris.
Thanks.
I see nothing more on the chat line for those questions. If there's any questions for Chris, please ask them while we set up for the next presentation. So our next presenter is Mike Underschultz for Forest Health. It is not a slide share document. He provided a document that summarizes the content, and he will be going through this. These documents have been posted online. A question did come through the chat that will we be posting the documents? Both the documents and slide decks that you saw today, as well as the recorded presentation, will be up online for future viewing. Mike?
Okay, thanks, David. So the document that I provided to everybody online, it's 35 pages of pure gold. Yeah, no, not really. So I'm not going to go over all of it, obviously. I will point you to a couple things. One thing is at the back of it, there's a Appendix 1 that has a quick sentence or two on everything, summarizing everything within the document. So that's a good little review thing for you. And so I'm going to focus in on, I think, about 6 different pieces of policy and legislation that are of interest because it's kind of timely and we deal with them a lot, or otherwise something that can be fairly significant. The first thing I'm going to talk about is the Mountain Pine Beetle Strategy and Action Plan. As everybody knows, pine beetle is a bit of an issue these days for us, if you've ever driven through Jasper. The strategy and action plan were developed in 2006. This is on page 20 if you're interested in following along. Basically, the most important part of the strategy, I would say, kind of outlines the province's basically our 2 prime objectives, which are to prevent the spread of beetles along the eastern slopes to protect our watersheds, as well as preventing the spread of mountain pine beetle eastward into the boreal forest. The action plan has a few details on how a lot of these things are how we're going to achieve those goals. And what it talks about is a sort of a 2-pronged approach. One is the beetle strategy, which is more of a short-term strategy where we're looking to control beetles, physically control beetles through various means of harvesting and or single tree treatments. And the second part of that is a longer term strategy, which is the pine focus strategy, which is the goal that was set at the time was to reduce the amount of susceptible pine in the province by 70% within 20 years. So that's about 10 years into the strategy at this point, with varying levels of success depending on the part of the province that we're interested in. The next one I want to talk about is also somewhat related to mountain pine beetle, and it's the timber management regulations. There are a few forest health things related in here. The most important one is how the regs deal with the transport and import of potentially infested material. So it's section 164.1, I believe that there's 2 subsections there. One regulates the import of conifer with bark attached into the province, and the other section deals with regulating the movement of conifer with bark within the province that may be infested. So the idea with bark attached is that beneath the bark is where the pests will be harbored. So a debarked log essentially would not have any import or transport restrictions. So for both of these, for the importation of conifer with bark, there's a directive that outlines the application and approval process for that type of thing. And similarly, for the movement of mountain pine beetle specifically infested wood, there is also what is called the Mountain Pine Beetle Log Management Directive that looks or provides guidelines and some restrictions on the movement of that wood. The next one I want to talk about deals, or I guess a couple of things that sort of deal with the pest control. A lot of people don't maybe consider this as a way to prevent and control pests, but harvesting obviously is a really great way to control insect and disease pests, also to prevent spread and other things. So when it comes to the sequence, the harvest sequencing, and how one can use harvesting as a control tool, the Forest Management Planning Standard in section 5.7 does talk about how insect and disease should be considered in the planning of the spatial harvest sequence. And then it doesn't provide really any details other than that. But then when you look to the ground rules, which is also described in the package here on page 19, section 10.1.1 talks about some specifics about prioritizing harvest plans, and it provides some ranks, which are essentially some guidelines about how one would rank harvest. So a rank 1 stand, there's 4 ranks here. So rank 1 stand would be something with the presence of mountain pine beetle or spruce beetle. So these are insect pests that can kill trees quickly as well as spread quickly. Rank 2, stand with a significant number of dead or dying trees resulting from fire or insect and disease, etc. So the idea here would be more of a salvage related priority. Rank 3, stands infected with dwarf mistletoes, spruce bloodworm, forest tent caterpillar, etc. So these are the group of pests that do have the ability to kill trees, do have some significance, and can be mitigated with harvest, but maybe not so damaging as something like spruce beetle or mountain pine beetle. And then the last rank 4 is stands infected with needle cast, western gall rust, root collar weevils, etc. These are kind of the innocuous forest health damage agents that are kind of everywhere, but they can blow up in certain areas and cause some problems. The next one I wanted to talk about is not really a forest tree pest, but it is an invasive plant. So both the Weed Control Act and the Public Lands Act that are kind of referenced on pages 2 and 6 respectively in the package outline a lot of the responsibilities of owners and occupants with regards to invasive plants. And the Weed Control Act is the overarching act when it comes to weed control. And summing it up very quickly, what it does is it requires owners and occupants of land to be responsible to control and prevent the spread of invasive plants that are listed under the act / regulations. The Public Lands Act as well has a clause in it that essentially repeats what the Weed Control Act says, but it just makes it even more clear that holders of Public Lands Act dispositions are responsible to follow the public land, or to follow the Weed Control Act when it comes to control and prevention. When it comes to forestry dispositions, it was a little bit unclear, or maybe is even still a little bit unclear of what the responsibilities of a timber disposition holder, so a lot of the stuff that Chris was just talking about, the different types of tenures, what their responsibilities would be. And it was back when, in I believe about 2003 or 4, when the department's legal counsel provided us with an opinion that said it was unclear whether a timber disposition holder is considered the occupant of the land. And the advice that was given to us was that they probably would not be considered the occupant of the land. So for that reason, the Weed Control Act wasn't necessarily completely relevant to a whole entire FMA, for example. Forest companies are responsible if they have a Public Lands Act disposition, which would be typically your roads or your camps or landings and things like that. The responsibilities for weed management on those types of dispositions are very clear. Within the cut block itself, they weren't. So the answer to this was the Weed Management and Forestry Operations Directive, which essentially tells you kind of the story of what I just told you, but then goes on to say that in the absence of that requirement for control, the Crown requires that timber disposition holders take prevention measures to prevent the introduction and spread of invasive plants. And lastly, the one I saved for last is kind of the crowning achievement of legislation from a forest health perspective, and that is a single clause within the Forest Prairie and Protection Act. That act, this is on page 10 of the document, and the act deals primarily with wildfire and so forth, but there is one clause in there that does deal with forest pest control, and it states that the minister may carry out on any land any control measure that the minister considers advisable for the prevention and control of injurious forest tree pest infestation. So this is a very powerful clause here that allows the government to do a whole bunch of things when it comes to, I guess, controlling and or preventing issues with forest pests. Just as an example, how things can get very complicated in Manitoba, a number of years back, they developed an Invasive Species Act that was, I'm not too familiar with the legislation, but I know that it is a large piece of legislation that essentially outlines all of the details that would go into a statement like Section 28. So without something like that, we do have a lot of ability to do things if necessary. This particular clause, I believe, has only been enacted once or twice in some situations in the past regarding mountain pine beetle control of some infested lumber being transported and things like that. But it does have some significance, especially thinking forward into the possibility of things like invasive species that might show up that require quick action. Those are the only ones I wanted to highlight for you guys today. So I'd be happy to take any questions. I do encourage you guys to have a look through the entire document. There's some other stuff in there, but do we got any questions? Not yet. Okay.
A lot of forest tenure questions. Thank you, Mike. If there's any questions, please make sure to put it on the chat or speak up here. We're gonna put the presentations on hold as I set up for the next presentation, which will be Shane, and we'll go from there. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Welcome back. There was no questions for Forest Health. So we're going to pass on to Shane Patterson to do our reclamation legislative review. Shane, take it away.
Sure. Thanks, David. Yeah, so in the next few minutes, I'm just going to give you a quick overview of some of the legislative and regulatory requirements as it relates to conservation reclamation and some of the governing acts and regs that we have in the province that apply both provincially as well as specifically to public land. So, there we go. So the four key pieces of legislation that I'm going to talk about, the first two are provincial. So these would be the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act, or APEA. Quite often it gets referred to as well as the Conservation Reclamation Regulation. And then the second two are primarily on Crown lands, and those would be the Public Lands Act as well as the Public Lands Administrative Regulation. So I'm going to through the presentation talk, there's some terminology that that occurs in both, in those acts and regs that are common to both public as well as provincially based activities. Talk a little bit about the difference. I'm going to refer to a term called specified land. So we use this under our reg to refer to industrial activities such as oil and gas on the landscape. But specified lands can also apply to forestry when we talk about like OSB mills, pulp and paper. So those plants or facilities are actually what we would call specified land and fall under APEA and would have an APEA approval for their activities. Some of the different land use decisions for reclamation. I'll talk a little bit during the presentation, a little bit about what we refer to as progressive or interim reclamation. So quite often in upstream oil and gas, we're trying to encourage those to promote faster reclamation, especially on forested land bases and big disturbances such as mines or in situ operations. And then some of the closure mechanisms that we have in the province when it comes to both specified and non-specified lands. So these would be the reclamation certificate as well as some clearance letters. So the Environmental Protection and Enhancement Act was proclaimed back in 1993. Its purpose was to support the protection and enhancement and wise use of the environment. So it really targets air, land, and water and encompasses all the living organisms. So we talk about biodiversity, a lot of our conservation planning that's embedded within both the acts and regs that we'll talk about are intended to kind of be directed towards protecting that biodiversity on the landscape. It's administered by Alberta Environment and Parks, but we do, portions of that have been delegated through the Responsible Energy Development Act to the Alberta Energy Regulator. So they issue APEA approvals and issue reclamation certificates for oil and gas related activities. So any of the activity up in the oil sands, the upstream oil and gas, coal mines in the province, as well as the seismic exploration programs or the oil sands exploration programs. So APEA has 10 main parts that go right from the administrative side through to enforcement. But the two key parts that I'll talk about are primarily the Section 5, which deals with the release of substances, and then Part 5, sorry, is release of substances, and Part 6, which deals with the conservation reclamation requirements and the duty of operators to conserve and reclaim. So APEA terminology. So under the first section, first part in APEA sets out a number of terms that are used throughout the document, but as show up in a lot of terminology when we talk about developing conservation reclamation plans. They also have been defined in the Public Lands Act and the Public Lands Administrative Regulation when it comes to things like dealing with conservation. So what we're meaning there is really the planning that's done up front to conserve things like topsoils or avoid key habitat that might be at risk, such as wetlands, or if you're working in the caribou management zones. To do a little bit more planning up front. And so what we've found over the last few decades is that better planning up front can often mitigate some of the challenges you're seeing on the back end with respect to reclamation. So we just got back from a tour up in the oil sands area with COSIA's Faster Forest program. looking at different ways of doing site preparation, but as well as planting on the back end and trying to learn a bit from standard practices that might be going on in forestry and how you can apply that to reclamation. So there's a lot of opportunities to transfer that knowledge from one sector to the next. The second one, dealing with reclamation. This is really all the work that's done after the disturbance to get that site back to what we're looking for as equivalent land capability. And I'll talk a little bit about that term in a minute. And really what reclamation covers is a broad range of things. It's removing all the infrastructure, so removing the roads, the plant sites, well sites if you're looking at those, some of the culverts that you might see in water crossings if you're looking at access roads into a site, all the groundwork that needs to be done, or the soil movement, the revegetation components to get that site back to as close as possible to what it was like there before that disturbance occurred on the landscape. And then any other things, so if there's contamination on site, dealing with that prior to applying for a reclamation certificate. So again, getting into the remediation work, whether that's done on site or whether you're hauling material away, any of that contamination. So it could be salt spills, could be hydrocarbons, and those types of things. The reclamation certificate, from our perspective, is a legal document that transfers the surface reclamation liability from the operator, so the operator of that specified land activity, back to the Crown, and it allows for the termination of surface agreements. So in the boreal or on public lands, it terminates that agreement that the Crown has with that operator around that specified land activity. So similar to the clearance letters for public lands for non-specified land activities, it's that closure mechanism that enables that liability to be transferred back to the Crown. The other term is a reclamation inquiry. So as part of that closure process, an inquiry is basically an assessment that's done by an inspector, when now that could be an inspector that works directly for environment parks, could be an inspector from the energy regulator, but we also have the ability under the conservation reclamation regulation to delegate that to, say, a municipal authority. So that's embedded within that regulation. And the first couple of sections that I won't go into too much detail or talk about too specifically about. It also involves the landowner or whatever stakeholders are involved. Potentially could be companies if you're working on Crown lands. They bring everybody together and talk about if there are issues left over from the reclamation work that's going on, and you try and address those in the field. It's different from the audit process that's set up specifically for the upstream oil and gas program, where when a rec cert application comes in for a well site, both on public as well as private land or on Crown land, that process is really a desktop review that gets done, and a certain percentage of those applications that come in receive an audit from the energy regulator. So that's tends to be in the neighborhood of 10 to 15% of those sites that come in. So under APIA, the two key sections are parts 5, the release of substances, and part 6, the conservation and reclamation requirements. And really the release of substances just deals with the obligation the operator has during the operation of its activity to report the release of any substance that may cause an adverse effect. So this could be for a well site, a salt spill from a producing well, could be a leak from a pipeline if you're looking at, say, pulp and paper, and effluent release that wasn't scheduled. So they have the duty to report that release and then take any remedial measures. And then there's enforcement requirements that we can go in and deal with, if they haven't gone in and done that reporting on a timely basis. The second part is part 6, and this really sets out the duty for operators to conserve and reclaim specified land. So they have a duty to do that planning up front, to reclaim on the back end and apply for a reclamation certificate. So this sets out the requirement where the CNR regulation then enacts the outcomes and sets the goals of what that goal of equivalent land capability. The last part is section 138, which deals with issuing and refusing to issue reclamation certificates. So inspectors can, within certain time periods, cancel reclamation certificates if there are issues that come up once that certificate's been issued, or they can go out during the inquiry. If they're find there are issues, they just won't issue a reclamation certificate altogether. So under APIA, there is the conservation reclamation regulation. So this gets into the specifics around the duties to conserve and reclaim and enable the department to develop guidelines, standards around the conservation and reclamation requirements for various sectors. So the first few sections of that regulation talk about some of the terms that I've talked about already, as well as set the goal or define what's required for achieving that equivalent land capability concept, or equivalent land capability concept. Section 12 deals with the content for reclamation certificate applications. So when it comes time for an operator to apply for a reclamation certificate, what content's required. So what assessment of the landscape, what vegetation assessments required, what level of soils assessments are required. So these are set out a couple of different ways. One is for upstream oil and gas. We've got a set of reclamation criteria that deal with specific land uses. So for the province, we've got right now a peatland criteria, a forested criteria, and a native grassland criteria, as well as the cultivated land one. So depending on the land use you're working in, one of those four criteria would apply. And then if an activity has an APIA approval, then those conservation reclamation requirements or the outcomes that are set out under that approval condition for what that operator needs to achieve. Section 15 deals with the liability period. So we have, when we do issue approvals or licenses and registrations for specified land activities, once that reclamation certificate's been applied for and that rec cert is issued, there's a post-reclamation liability period that applies. So depending on the activity and who potentially the regulator is, that liability period may vary from the date the reclamation certificate is issued upwards to 25 years for the oil and gas sector. And that's just based on historically how we've approached that and sheer volume of numbers. So for example, recently the CNR rig was amended to include renewables because their approvals issued through the Alberta Utilities Commission. They have a 5-year post-certification liability period, whereas in situ operations, once that reclamation certificate is issued by the regulator, that liability transfers back the date that rec cert's issued. But upstream oil and gas, so the well site in the forested area has a 25-year post-certification liability period. Regardless of the activity, any contamination has a lifetime liability period. So, 30 years from now, potentially if an operator, that land gets re-entered for some use and they find contamination, if that operator is still on the landscape, you can come back and get them to clean it up. Section 16 to 24 deals with reclamation security. So these primarily, this really applies to mines, so the oil sands and coal mines, and our ability to collect reclamation security for those activities. And then finally is that closure mechanism, that reclamation certificate, is that legal document that transfers that liability from the operator back to the Crown. Again, some of the key pieces of terminology under the CNR reg. So for forestry, an example would be the definition for plant. These definitions really are pretty broad, and they're meant to be broad to cover a wide range of activities. So for a pulp and paper mill, it could include the facility. It includes any of the roads associated with it, so that plant would have an obligation, or that operator, like Alpac, would have an obligation to reclaim that plant site, as well as any associated roads that it used in association with that activity. Same thing with an in situ operation. That specified land term that I talked about earlier, this is a key one that's quite often used, because when we refer to specified lands in general, it refers to a lot of different types of activities on the landscape that range anywhere in size from an individual well site through to an oil sands project. And as I mentioned earlier this year, the CNR rig was amended to include renewable energy operations. So these will be, for example, wind, solar, and geothermal that you may see over the next few years. Under the regulation, and what we're moving to now is a lot more professional sign-off, so directly applicable to you as practitioners for developing things like conservation reclamation plans or requiring sign-off once you do have your designation. So for that, while our regs do apply provincially, or our acts do apply provincially, there are some exceptions with respect to federal lands. So the requirement to apply for a reclamation certificate doesn't apply to federal lands or for agricultural operations. Once we get into the residential use, if it was specified land before, they still have to apply for a rec cert that can be transferred. And then finally, the term equivalent land capability. Really what this is the intent after that disturbance has occurred of that reclamation or the various activities that occur for reclaiming that site back to that equivalent land capability is looking at, ideally, we'd like to go back to whatever that land use was prior to the disturbance. Operators do have the option if they're working with stakeholders and they're looking for alternative land uses or looking at a land use change. For example, if it's going from a forested site to a wetland site or from a wetland to an uplands condition, they do have to apply for a change in land use that's depending on the reasoning behind it or the justification behind it can be approved by the department. So that's why it's important to recognize that even though we would preferentially like you to go back to that pre-disturbance land use, we can approve other types of land use changes. So that individual land use may not necessarily be identical to what was there before. The last two are two that are applicable to public land specifically, and this would be the Public Lands Act. So again, definitions like equivalent capability and conservation show up again in these acts. There's some slight differences especially when you look at something like the definition of equivalent capability. You start to see terms like ecosystem goods and services show up in that equivalent capability definition under the Public Lands Act. And really, this act just sets the ability for the minister to designate or impose conditions on the disposition holder, whether it's on the applications or as well as the renewals, and then the disposition holders being bound by the conditions in the act. And one of these conditions would be the duty to reclaim on the back end. So under the Public Lands Administrative Regulation kind of sets out these requirements. And there is going to be some overlap between PLAR as well as the CNR reg. You could have duplicative requirements where, like for example, a well site on public land will require a disposition, but quite often to avoid that duplication, if the requirements that are set out under the CNR rig and that reclamation requirements, if those are achieved, then quite often that disposition can get canceled without it's met those reclamation requirements. So Section 21 of PLAR sets out really the duties of that, the formal disposition of the authorization holder must whether it's at the direction of the director or on their own, apply for a reclamation or cancellation of that disposition, but they would also be required to go through it and reclaim that site and get a reclamation certificate if applicable. So Section 23 sets out those requirements that the director can, if they feel the operator is not meeting the intent of what they have under their disposition or the conditions of their disposition, direct that operator to reclaim their site and deal with that. So let's see where else. As well as the operators, once they're done with their activity on the landscape and can't get their disposition canceled, they would have to go through that process again to restore that land to that equivalent land capability or whatever condition or set of conditions are set out under their approval that make me, like we heard about the regional planning initiative, various regional planning initiatives previously. So they've got to meet whatever conditions were set out at the start of their activity. So finally, the closure tools. So really, there's two main mechanisms for both specified lands under a PIA and non-specified lands under the Public Lands Act. And you'll see similar types of terms under the Mines and Minerals Act. So for specified lands, we have reclamation criteria that apply to upstream oil and gas sites and the oil sands exploration programs. So those are programs that are regulated under AER and have that 25-year surface liability period, primarily for upstream oil and gas. Then we also have mechanisms such as the conservation reclamation plans. These would be PIA approval activities. I should note on this one, the wind power and solar fall under that CNR plan requirement now. We just released a directive here about a week ago that requires those activities to develop conservation reclamation plans as part of their application into AUC, as well as to keep those updated on a periodic basis. And so there's similar requirements for sand and gravel operations, oil sands mines, and in situ to get a conservation reclamation plan approved as part of their PIA approval application, and then keep those updated on a periodic basis. And so once that activity is completed on the landscape, they would then go through an application process to apply for a reclamation certificate. For non-specified land, so these would be activities such as roads that weren't associated with the specified land, geophysical programs, different types of miscellaneous leases like campgrounds, airstrips, even power lines could apply for a letter of clearance to close out or apply to have that disposition canceled. So if there are any questions, David stepped out, so.
Okay. Oh, questions? Yeah. Thanks, Shane.
So we'll just prep up Donna Lawrence. You're on the next one here. Let me get you prepped up and ready for you. Hello, Donna Lawrence. Are you available?
I am.
Perfect. It's always fun running remotely from different spots. So. I'd like to introduce Donna Lawrence, Rangeland Management Specialist, to talk about the range portion of the exam. I will try to mute myself, and away you go, Donna.
Thank you, Dave. So I will give you a very brief overview of the legislation pertaining to livestock grazing on public land and an overview of the grazing timber integration policy and grazing timber agreements. That's the content for today. Next, please, David. Thank you. So here's our map of Alberta, green and white area, and the black and red are grazing dispositions. The red are actually grazing reserves. The black are grazing dispositions throughout Alberta. So you can see the distribution, and you'll see where we would have the overlap then with grazing interests and timber interests in that green area, white area fringe. But there is grazing within the green area and along that fringe and within the white area where we have timber and grazing overlapping. Okay, next slide. Here's our map of Alberta again, but this is with the natural subregions. And I like to show this map because, again, it's got the distribution of grazing, but by natural subregions. So if we look at the distribution through grazing, I think most people think of grazing in Alberta as grassland grazing. But if we look at the, say, kilometer square column there for boreal and foothills, if you add those two together, that's about 15,500 square kilometers of grazing. Public land grazing, that is, within the boreal and foothills natural regions. And if you add the parkland and grasslands, which are predominantly where we have our grassland grazing, that's 12,700 kilometers square of grazing. So forest grazing is just as important grazing resource in Alberta as the grasslands for sure. And when I present those stats, people are usually quite surprised by that. So it's important we have this talk today then about the grazing timber integration on public land. Next slide. So our unit of allocation for grazing on public land is the AUM, and that is a forage-based number, or forage production-based number, not a cow number, which is another common misunderstanding. So it's a forage-based number, and the forage in pounds per acre or kilograms per hectare comes from clipping permanent sampling sites. We call them range reference areas, but they're long-term monitoring sites. We've been managing the composition of plant community types, the forage they produce, and then the impact of grazing on those forested communities. So the data that we get from these reference areas are published in these guides. Good cue, David. And they're published in the guides. And there's an example of the boreal dry and central mixedwood there, but we have guides for all of the natural subregions that have livestock grazing in them across the province. And the nice thing about these guides is that they are written in the same ecological classification as the field guides that you're used to using. So the terminology of ecosite phase, plant community type, that's all similar to the ecological classification used throughout the province. So we're all speaking the same language. So that gives you a little bit of information about the science behind the allocation that we do for grazing. So we have grazing dispositions, they are allocations. The rangeland agrologists, there's about 35 of them in the province. They're the people that are responsible for doing the assessments and the allocations, the renewal inspections, and any kind of monitoring. They also work with the disposition holder. Those, we have about 7,000 of them in the province that work as our agents to manage grazing across the province. So, and specialists like me were the folks that put together all the science and tools for the agrologists to use for that. So getting to the legislation then, there are two major acts that cover livestock grazing or relate to livestock grazing on public land. The first one is the Public Lands Act. We heard Shane talk lots about the other portions of Public Lands Act, and then the Public Lands Administration Regulation that would apply to grazing in the green area and the white area. And then there's the Forest Reserve Act, which applies specifically to the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve. So I'll talk about that a bit later. We'll just talk about the Public Lands Act first. So the Public Lands Act and PLAR, the regulation, have four types of dispositions to allocate grazing. They're essentially the same, but they differ a little bit on tenure length and tenure rights. And the next slide has a chart for you. This is another one that would be good to become familiar with for your exam. A grazing lease is one of our long-term dispositions. It's mostly 10 years, can be up to 20 years, mostly used in the white area. They can be in the green area, but where they are in the green area, they're a withdrawal from the FMA. So we can't allocate grazing through a lease on top of an FMA. They can't be within an FMA. So if you see holes within your FMA, they might be around grazing lease, actually. The next long-term tenure would be the grazing license or forest grazing license. And these are used in the green area because they can be allocated within an FMA. So those two dispositions can overlap. It is another 10-year disposition. Then we have the grazing permits and head tax permits. They are annual permits. There's not a whole lot of these in the province, but they do exist. Sometimes they're used for temporary or emergency situations, and they can overlap other dispositions. It's important, just go back, David, that if you look down the timber grazing column there, you'll see that none of the dispositions can actually restrict access for timber removal. So that's important to note. They can't restrict access, but on a grazing lease, or actually, sorry, in any disposition, they can set conditions. So those conditions are usually dealt with through a grazing timber agreement. So timber removal can happen on all those dispositions, but they cannot commence until there's a grazing timber agreement that's been developed and signed off by both proponents. Okay, so that's very important. Sort of like, I think it was Chris that said, it's an allocation, but sorry, it's a, better not, I wrote it down, but I can't seem to find it here. But Chris had said something about not the right to harvest. It's the same thing. You cannot harvest until you have that signed GTA. Okay, so in the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve, we have the Forest Reserve Act that applies to livestock grazing. So that's a very specific part of the province, in the southern part of the province there along the eastern slopes. Next slide. So the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve is a specific area of the province that was designated many, many years ago for the conservation of forests and other vegetation, particularly in the context of optimal watershed supply or protecting the headwaters. So that's an important fact that sort of dictates why the act is written the way it is written. So next slide. Here's a close-up of the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve, and you can see it's divided into 91 allotments, and each of those allotments could have several distribution units in them, and each of those units will have an AUM allocation to it. So the same sort of process applies where the agrologist uses the tools and information, the guides available to them to assess the amount of grazing there and then do the allocation. They do the assessments, allocation, renewal inspections, all of that. The same process applies. It's just a different act that governs that particular part of the province. Okay, and in the Forest Reserve regulation, there are two types of permits that we use to allocate grazing. The regular permit is the long-term permit, so up to 10 years, and a temporary permit is for terms less than 5 years. And you'll notice in that grazing timber column there too that these dispositions as well cannot restrict access for timber removal. However, remember, timber removal cannot happen until there's a signed grazing timber agreement, and that has to be signed by both proponents. Okay, so just to summarize those two acts, there's the Public Lands Act for green area, white area. There's the Forest Reserve Act specifically for the Rocky Mountain Forest Reserve. They have different types of dispositions, but none of them have the ability to restrict access for timber harvesting. However, timber harvesting can't happen until there's a signed GTA. Okay, so I keep mentioning the signed GTA. Well, the grazing timber integration policy and manual were developed in 2011. I think it was signed off, so it was a few years in development. But timber industry, livestock industry, government came together and created the grazing timber integration manual and policy. And these two documents provide direction on how these two industries are to operate on public land together. Next. So the objective of the integration is to have both industries out there operating together, but not having significant impact on each other. So to minimize the effect of timber on grazing and to minimize the effect of grazing on timber, but also to minimize the impact to the other resource values on public land as well, because of course it is still public land. We have to maintain all the other resource values that we expect to derive from public land. Okay, so there's those three main objectives of integration on the landscape. Next. So the policy and manual do exist. There is a lot of instruction within those documents to create your grazing timber agreement. And we've realized that one of the best benefits we have from having this requirement is just having the communication between both parties. It really helps to bring everybody together and work together. Of course, there's not always agreement, so there is a dispute resolution process built into the process as well. But we find for most of the part, people can come together. Just click again right away, David, here. I've put this. There's a URL that'll come up if you click. Oops, sorry. Just go back one. There's the URL at the top. Sorry, I should have just made it pop up right away. So all of the information on grazing timber integration, the policy manual, any regional grazing plans that are developed, examples, worksheets, templates, those are all available on the website. So that's an important URL to remember or to write down and look for that. Although if you type in grazing timber integration Alberta, you'll come to this information. You'll also see GTAs mentioned in the timber harvest planning and operational ground rules framework documentation too. There will be a range management section there in that document that will refer to GTAs as well. So a grazing timber agreement should be developed where there is overlap of grazing and timber activity, especially where there's planned to be active harvesting. or where grazing is being introduced into an FMA. That would be another place for a grazing timber agreement. There is a clause that does say that if there are no concerns between the two parties, written confirmation stating this is sufficient, and that GTA doesn't have to be anything more than that particular letter. We don't recommend that because you can think of a grazing timber agreement as sort of a risk management tool. Quite often the two parties don't necessarily understand how their operations will affect each other till they're actually affecting each other, and then it's kind of too late for a GTA. So it's important to have a GTA in place just to help address some of those issues that might arise. And again, it's the real benefit of a GTA is the communication tool there. So it is something that's developed between the two industries directly themselves, but it is endorsed by the government to make sure it aligns with existing legislation and the intent of the legislation. Next slide. So there are some basic minimal requirements for a GTA, and there are examples on the website that I gave you the URL. So I think it would be a benefit for you to take a closer look at those. I think that the exam would probably focus on some of this information. So if you were to develop a GTA, what kind of information is required? And there's some good examples on the website there for you. So just to reiterate, there are the Public Lands Act, there's the Forest Reserve Act, there's different types of dispositions, grazing leases used primarily in the white area outside an FMA. They can't be used within an FMA, and a forest grazing license that can be used within the FMA. So it's primarily used in the green area. And there's grazing permits, but none of those dispositions can restrict timber harvesting, but you do require a signed grazing timber agreement that's been developed between both proponents before timber harvesting can occur. So really quick and brief summary of all that. If you have any questions, I can answer them.
Yep, Donna, we have a couple of questions on the line. First question asks around public access. Can a grazing lease or grazing operation restrict public access?
If you want to just go back to that chart, yeah, no, they cannot restrict public access, but on a grazing lease, they can set some controls over public access. So on a grazing lease, they can, while the livestock are out there, they can actually set some controls. So like foot access only, no ATVs, that sort of thing. So there's a rec access management website that they are to list their contact information and their conditions for access, so that you can phone and talk to them and arrange to get in there. But so it's not complete control, but they can set controls on that. But that's only on a grazing lease.
Okay. And then the next question, we answered in chat, but what is an AUM? It's an animal unit month.
Yes, so it's an animal unit month. So it's the amount of forage that an animal unit, which is defined as a 1,000-pound cow, needs to survive for a month, basically. So an animal unit month. So it's not an animal number, it is a forage number, because it's the forage that a 1,000-pound animal needs to sustain itself for a month. That's why it's related to the forage clipping that we do on our reference areas. It's derived from the productivity of the type of plant community type that you're planning to graze. It's a forage number.
That's all the questions on chat. We can, if you guys have any more questions, you can unmute your mic and ask your question or type it into the chat. This is our last presentation. I'm going to screw up his last name. Paul Kaniga, the biologist, was unable to join us today. So unfortunately, we do not have a species at risk or biology person here. So this is our last presentation. We are wrapping up earlier than we expected. So I want to thank you guys for your participation and your time. The college will be sending out a poll, because I don't see it up on the Zoom app, but we're going to ask you how you enjoyed this format. Does this format work for you guys with your busy schedules, that type of thing, just so that we can create some value and ensure that we're meeting the objectives of the writers. So I appreciate your time today, and I appreciate the time of all the volunteers who helped put this on, especially the subject matter experts. Oh, as I speak, the poll arrives. So thank you, Constance, at the AAFMP offices for that. So please fill out the poll and submit your responses. It helps us to ensure that we're delivering you guys the best product that we can. Appreciate your time. Have a good day. And if you are continuing to work, enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you. Have a good day.